Hello everyone, welcome to EPG Pathshala. My name is Pujita Guha and I am currently enrolled as a PhD student in the Cinema Studies Department, Jawaharlal Nehru University. I am also a visiting faculty at the Delhi College of Arts and Commerce. Today, I am going to give you a basic layout of the women-centric melodrama that emerged in the post-war context. I am going to discuss this through the careers of three great filmmakers, Mikio Naruse, Yasujiro Ozu and Kenji Mizoguchi. I will not only talk about the melodramatic themes that they speak, but also the different stylistic traits that they bring to the table. At the end of the paper, I am going to give a brief critical commentary on this melodramatic form and then move on to darker genres that speak about a different experience of the history. This paper is going to be divided into three major parts. First, an introduction and small capsules on Mikio Naruse and Yasujiro Ozu's careers and their aesthetic traits. The second, the major one, is going to be an extensive analysis of Kenji Mizoguchi's film Sanshodayu and his career overall. The third is going to be a critical commentary on his films and a move on to darker genres like noir and exemplified through a film like A Fugitive from the Past. Introduction. Feminist theories over the years have argued that the questions of women's sexuality and social function are central to the cultural productions of modernity. This is precisely because the contemporary anxieties surrounding sexuality systematically reflect the norms of the pre-modern social formation and the challenges that are posited to them in the contemporary. In the Japanese film context, female sexuality remained contained in the burlesque and striptease shows that began appearing steadily in post-war Japanese films on crime and lower ends of society. However, for the contours of female subjectivity, we must look into the contemporary home drama or the Shoshimi Eiga. The genre took prominent shape in post-war Japan with the works of Mikio Naruse, Yasujiro Ozu and Kenji Mizoguchi. All three of them, in their own particular ways, depicted the nation caught between the liberal ethos of women's rights and universal suffrage brought about by increased social mobility and the conservative values espoused within the traditional boundaries of the bourgeois family. Mizoguchi's films, ornate and pictorial, dealt with the lives of women thrown into a nefarious underworld, the geisha or prostitute being a typical figure. Ozu showed generations trying to bridge historical gaps, especially as it emerged in the shift away from arranged to love marriages. And in Naruse, they were about the inevitable unhappiness of the marital institution. Moreover, all of them dealt with questions about women's role in the family, the unequal opportunities afforded to women, and the questions of women's self-determination in public and private spaces. Even if these films stopped short of outright or explicit social criticism, there was an unmistakable and often clearly articulated sense that despite the democratic reforms of post-war Japan, women's social roles remained limited by traditional gender norms. And yet, none of them could be thought of as feminist directors. Neither the language nor the ideology of contemporary feminism was applicable to their practice. The women in these films were objects of distant study to be aesthetically contemplated in all their fragile beauty. Mikio Naruse. Throughout his career and in his 1954 film especially, Bankiku, Late Chrysanthemums, Mikio Naruse evokes a familiar trope of Japanese poetics, the equation of women with flowers, figure 4.1a. Both are objects of subtle beauty that ebb and fade away and stand in for graceful morality. And yet, Naruse's film challenges this poetic paradigm by placing his fading flowers, four middle-aged women geishas, in the midst of the complex social and economic landscape of post-war Tokyo. The itinerant beggars and sales who dot the landscape of the film inscribe a current of desperation and poverty within the life of the city, a tension that can be erased only through excessive drinking. Naruse observes the women with their romantic longings and memories, their conversations doused with rounds of sake. However, it should be noted that the geisha's survival is to some extent at the expense of others. Both kin and nobu run their small businesses on the basis of small domestic hierarchies. Kin's deaf maid / helper is a childlike entity to the moneylender, figure 4.1b, while Nobu's husband is imagined as a timid, docile figure, figure 4.1c. And yet, neither of these women are portrayed as authoritarian figures, pandering to any matriarchal fantasies. Instead, these relationships reflect diversions from the dominant model of the Japanese family structure, in which a woman's place is, even in modernity, tightly inscribed within existing patriarchal norms. Sometimes referred to as the number 4 director of studio-era Japanese cinema after Kurosawa, Mizoguchi and Ozu, Naruse has often been elided in film histories for his lack of an immediately identifiable arty trademark. Naruse's style is, in comparison to his better-known peers, a more invisible one that is, in the first place, put in the service of the story, of the characters and the emotions in any given scene. Naruse builds up a scene with a steady progression of medium-length shots, and the way each scene segues into the next in a graceful flow marks the ebb and flow of the conversation itself, a technique David Bordwell calls the piecemeal decoupage. Early in the film, Sanchiko reveals to her mother Tomi, one of the protagonists in the film, that she is about to get married, a meeting where Tomi hopes to reveal about her own financial state. Before and through the conversation, Naruse sets up an unset conflict and contrast between the mother and the daughter looking vivaciously into the mirror, proud of her youthful looks, while the mother is wary of hers. Sanchiko, unlike her mother, is not a flower in decay, a fact that we see figure out in figure 4.2a, panel 1. In panels 2 to 4, we see the conversation move back and forth between the two, shot in successive frames of mid-length range. Few frames have been omitted here for clarity. Naruse quietly builds up a drama of youthful exuberance and aging dismay, revealing the family structure destroyed in and through the war. As the conversation draws to a close, in panels 5 and 6 that is, Tomi chooses to suppress her anguish and instead appears frail and distracted, looking away. In the last two panels, 7 and 8, we see the scene draw to a comical close when Tomi sneezes and Sanchiko turns away, slightly disdainful of her mother. Kurosawa had once famously described Naruse's films as a deep river with a quiet surface disguising a fast-raging current underneath. As a metaphor, it encapsulates both the effect of Naruse's seamless montage and the deep emotional effects of his dramaturgy. This is a cinema of missed opportunities, averted eyes, failed marriages and broken families. And yet, as a melodrama, it is also a cinema about ordinary people with ordinary problems. Naruse's method is one of passive observation, as he lays out his characters against an extremely modern setup, but at the same time aesthetically very traditional, maintaining a formal architectural harmony. Figure 4.2b. In this graphic match cut, Naruse cuts between Kin's helper cleaning the house to that of Tame, one of Kin's clients and older friends cleaning her own. A poetic interjection about Tame's fallen state of affairs from her once well-to-doing life. This match cut nevertheless maintains a passive, restrained observation that places architecture at the heart of the image. It is against the absolutely gridded lines of the window panes, the straight lines of the rooms, the still rectangular shadows that the figure moves against, their chaotic world thrown by the quietude of the architecture. Yasujiro Ozu. In late spring 1949, Professor Shikuchi Somiya, in a conversation with her sister Tami, discussed what they think of young women, a generation which in the post-war American scenario has lost its traditional femininity. Figure 4.3. Aunt Tami whines that while young brides now gleefully eat and jump right into the sake in their weddings, in her days only the blessings of the elderly had to suffice. Shukuchi mildly protests, proffering that her sister too would have wholeheartedly eaten sashimis if her wedding were to take place in the film's present. And yet, as one watches the film, one realizes that neither Shikuchi nor his daughter Noriko are renegade feminists. She particularly is caught between Western aspiration. She wears Western clothes and cycles freely by the countryside, and traditional dogmas. She aspires to serve her benevolent father throughout her life and even passes moralizing judgments at her friend who might have become impregnated before marriage. Ozu's women, therefore, are almost bewildering in their mix of old and new, demure and assertive, Western and Japanese, rational and emotional, independent and self-effacing. They are not modern by the legal ability to work and marry independently, not traditional by dint of being a demure housewife. Despite portraying a nation and its people in turbulence, Ozu, however, evokes a consistently measured quasi-Zen aesthetic in all his films. His films are uneventful, bordering on silence, and are comprised mostly of mild dialogue and little gestures. His restrained style seeks to capture the humdrum of everyday life, or even the sublime feeling of monono aware, the transient sadness of life. This transience of life is emblematized in the pillow shots that appear as transitional frames between scenes. These are still life or neutral images that punctuate the film within visual and emotional resting points, or situate the film in the times and spaces the narrative is unfolding. In figure 4.4, we see the iconic pillow shot of the Coca-Cola billboard from late spring, which, as many scholars have argued, is Ozu's subtle commentary on the increased American presence in Japanese culture, especially since the frame appears in conjunction to Noriko having fun with a male friend by the lonely beach. In the opening sequence of Tokyo Story, a pillow shot depicts a mountain garden with a home at a distance, figure 4.5a, cutting next into the interior of a home where the elderly are sitting in the drawing room, figure 4.5b. In his characteristic style, he shoots the two of them in a famous setup of the tatami shot, in which the camera eye is placed at waist height as if sitting on the tatami mat. The shot is framed in such a way that the natural lines of the room symmetrically align with the borders of the frames. It not only reminds us of Ozu's penchant for consistency and order, but also that his characters are framed by the spaces they inhabit. Moreover, these static shots are enframed in 50 mm lens, the lens that most closely mimics the human eye. It helps us intimately observe the characters, placing them at the same eye level as the sitting characters within the scene. This method of framing, however, calls for a slightly unorthodox logic of editing. To give a coherent sense of space and scenes where two or more interacting characters are shot separately in close-ups, that is, Hollywood had designed the 180-degree rule, a straight line axis that could not be crossed because it would disorient the viewer's left-right orientation precisely because the characters faced each other. In figure 4.5c, we see the image depicts two characters facing each other, and the dashed line is the 180-degree line that cannot be breached. If it is breached, as seen from the red position of the camera, it will give mirroring directions on screen, thus disorienting the viewer. Here, however, since characters are often placed sideways, Ozu regularly breaches the 180-degree line, placing his camera directly opposite to his original axis, cutting between the axes and the characters as conversations ensue. Figure 4.5D and 4.5E. In this scene, the camera not only breaches the 180-degree line but regularly cuts back and forth so as to place the camera right in the conversational space. Unlike the 180-degree line that imagines the audience as if they are viewing action on a theatrical stage, Ozu truly invites his audience into the frame and the world his protagonists inhabit. Kenji Mizoguchi. With the life of Oharu 1952, Ugetsu Monogatari 1953 and Sansho Dayu 1954, Kenji Mizoguchi effectively became the darling of the European cinephiles of the 50s. They were enamored by the passionate performances in his film, the Orientalist aesthetics, and most remarkably his use of long-take shooting style, a technique which relies heavily on complex tracking and crane shots. Critics link them to the traditional Japanese idioms of scroll painting and kabuki theatre, which Mizoguchi's uninterrupted portrayal of landscape and aristocratic architecture certainly reflected. If in his wartime career Mizoguchi made monumental films combining large set pieces with grandiose martial tales, figure 4.6, in his post-time career Mizoguchi tilted towards the democratic demands of the occupation regime. His long fluid camera movements now liltingly echoed the innumerable stories of suffering women in violent and oppressive regimes. To elucidate Mizoguchi's late pictorial style, one must turn to an early scene in Oharu. The heroine Oharu and her family have been exiled since Oharu's affair with a low-lying samurai is forbidden by social rank. The pivotal moment of the shot or the scene occurs when the mother receives a letter from Oharu's lover, figure 4.7a. Warning Oharu that her father must not learn of it, she turns to keep an eye, thus building up the tension while Oharu slides behind the hanging kimono to read it, figure 4.7b. The kimono first appears as a realistic backdrop in the frame, only to then become a translucent screen that conceals the women and their fragile, transient expressions. Moreover, unlike conventional cinematic norms that necessitate a close-up of the face, Mizoguchi chooses to hide her distraught expressions, her back turned to us. Hereafter, Oharu suddenly scuttles towards the frame right, while her mother turns and lunges between the kimonos, a struggle ensuing between them, figure 4.7c and figure 4.7d. Oharu rushes out of the frame with a knife that glints briefly as her mother follows her, the two zigzagging through the bamboo groves, figure 4.7e. Here too, Mizoguchi plays a game of visibility as the characters move between nearness and depth, light and shadow, the camera following him in a high-angle shot, lyrically panning across the grove. Soon after, the two collapse on the ground, Oharu's grief having given way to despair, figure 4.7g. Her desperation becomes all the more poignant against the stillness of the grove, the placid landscape absorbing her grief even as the sedate camera watches her on. In Sansho Dayu, Mizoguchi marries the tropes of a family melodrama to a quasi-historical reflection of war and slavery panning out in Japan's Heian period. The film is told through the eyes of the brother and sisters Ushio and Anju, who are captured as children and grow up within the confines of a slave camp. Their slave master Sansho is demonically villainous, branding those who disobey him on the forehead with a hot iron mark, figure 4.a and figure 4.b. The excessive brutalities of these scenes is expressed mainly in the terrified faces and screams of Sansho's victims and their witnesses, figure 4.8c. Fear is amplified not through its depiction but by its implication, an indication of what lies outside the immediate frame. Therefore, it is against the horrors of such outrageous violence that the film's sublime landscape compositions accrue their aesthetic weight. The centerpiece of Sansho, The scene that is perhaps most emblematic of the film's aesthetic is the one in which Anju escapes Sancho's camp only to wade slowly into the water and disappear under a ripple of concentric waves. Preceded by a frenetic pack of Sancho's slaves who look for their fugitive in the forest, figure 4.8d, the scene cuts to Anju praying within the deep forest before she is to walk into the water, figure 4.8e and 4.8f. In this painterly rendition of the landscape, Mizoguchi fills the frame with dense fog that wafts across the frame, giving it a requisite sense of mystique. Against the dense, occluding white background, the bamboo groves stand out as outlines or ink paintings, their fine contours and differential grading caught in the sharp depth of the image. As Anju pierces the stillness of the water with her meditative, almost somnambulistic walk into it, Mizoguchi overlays this pictorial minimalism with a harrowing anguish of her mother's voice, who, separated from her children early in the film, remembers them now in the legendary song, Anju, Zushio, how long I for you, isn't life torture? Introduced only at the end in Mori Ogai's original text, in the film it enacts as a leitmotif, joining and separating generations, recurring in the films as having never left us. First appearing in Anju's chance encounter with a peasant girl who heard it sung to her, the refrain returns later in the film, in which Anju and Zushio, alone in the forest, seem to hear their mother calling out to them, figure 4.8g and figure 4.8h. This sound appears as if floating in from the distance, like a plaintive cooing of the turtle dove, a lingering cadence of Anju, Zushio, pulling them closer to this great lament. Indeed, it is impossible to think of Sancho without its music. The film's flute and harp-driven score by long-term collaborator Fumio Hayasaka is one of the most delicate in Mizoguchi's oeuvre. It toes the fine line of exhuming the emotion latent in the image without quite fully rendering it explicit. Critical comment. Scholars have noted that until Anju's suicide, the two children are equals, both equally abundant by a tragedy of fates. It is here, however, that Zushio is corrupted by the master's brutality, and Anju hears the mournful agony of her mother, immortalized in the song. When Zushio is given the office, it becomes evident that Anju's sacrifice is the key to social stability and moral order. It is a man's world in which women must ultimately suffer, express the cruelties of this world within their mute bursts of anguish. In this, Anju represents Mizoguchi's investment in Feminissuto. Defined as a special brand of Japanese feminism, it deals with an aesthetic appreciation of women rather than a championing of women's rights. His women are graceful in their sacrifice and suffering, and social condemnation is balanced with pity and resignation. Echoing the Feminissuto sensibility, neither Kinyo Taka's performance as the grieving mother nor Kyoko Kagawa as Anju really imbue their characters with personality. Rather, they come to embody mere icons of grief. The iconic status of Sancho in Japanese film history may therefore help us identify some of the deeply rooted ideological contradictions in post-war Japan. On one hand, keeping with the larger public discourses of humanism and individual rights, the film speaks of how man must be merciful to fellow humans, a message to be passed from the father to son. On the other hand, the film upholds resignation, passivity and asceticism linked to a Buddhist ideology that does not sit well with the activism of emancipation. In a film, there is no middle class, and by its end, the film cannot transcend the feudal Buddhist class structure that produces the slave system in the first place. Moreover, the climactic reunion of mother and son gestures a familiar resolution of the family drama and resurrects a new patriarch to come, Zushio. He is archetypically the modern bourgeoisie. He abnegates feudal property in lieu of modern values, benevolent and yet impassive in his ways. Sancho enacts a remarkable conjunction of Buddhist aesthetics and bourgeois values of individual rights and desires, proof to cinema's ability to bring together the impermanence and futility of Zen with the dramatic excess of high melodrama. Conclusion. Fugitive from the past. If Mizoguchi Sancho Dayu presents a traumatic history that can be closed or forgotten, a family partially reconstituted in lieu of a promising future, then Tomu Uchida's Kigokaika, Straits of Hunger or Fugitive from the Past 1965, speaks of a history that never dies but haunts and demands justice in all times to come. Adapting Susumu Minakami's 1962 novel of the same name, Fugitive is about a violent crime during the chaotic years of the World War II that is suppressed and forgotten in the subsequent golden years of Japan's post-war economic recovery, only to then reappear in the turbulent 60s. An allegory of how Japan deals with its own traumatic past, Uchida argues, everyone shares the trauma in equal measure in this film, though repressed in the present. Yae, the prostitute, has given up her life when she remembers Inugai as the fugitive from the past, her affectionate, undying memory of him ultimately proving fatal. Yumisaka, the police officer who fanatically works on the original crime, is made to retire forcefully, only to find employment and restitution in the present. As for the Yakuza turned businessman, Inugai, history comes back to haunt his well-to-do life. Uchida methodically intercuts related individual narratives here and presents slices of interaction where these narratives converge, all pressed over the guilt of the past, the danger of the present, and the uncertainty of the future. Set 2 years after the end of World War II, the first half of Fugitive manages to consistently evoke the wartime spectre of a desperate Japan, figure 4.9. It is caught between the ravaging tycoon, the swiftly spreading fire, the high winds, the thick smoke, and citizens chaotically ferrying through the streets and the seas. Inugai and his partners are uniformed as veterans, and Iwanai echoes a war zone. Uchida supplements these frenzied scenes with a roving and shaking camera fraught with the tensions of the time. This probing, wavering cinematography persists even after the crime is over and carries long into the concluding part of the first half to depict a Tokyo that Yae sees, a big city plagued with black marketeering, rationing, political and street violence. Figure 4.10. The camera briefly stabilizes in the second half when Yae is happily settled in a family-run brothel, but the dark, unstable imagery returns with a flash from the past. Coupled with the film's shaky camera, Uchida presents a grainy 35mm blown up from 16mm, boldly interrupted by solarized images in key moments of emotion and insight. Figure 4.11. These negative images appear like glimpses from the underworld into the suppressed darkness that is suspected beneath the surface. The film, with its noirish tendencies, its dark long shadows and long ethical probings, energetic yet quietly probing the wartime trauma, has often been labeled as a new wave film. Though Uchida was almost 70 when he made these films, generations apart from the young filmmakers of the new wave, it nevertheless was a bold and epic tour de force achieved by a filmmaker who lived through Japan's dark days in Manchuria and who replaced his nationalism with a full appreciation of the contradictions that shaped his homeland. Thank you.